What if a single moment could change the world? Imagine being in a situation where power, authority, and justice collide in a way that no one expects. In this jaw-dropping story, a billionaire takes on a rogue officer in a social experiment that exposes deep-seated biases in society. Watch as Elon Musk turns a simple park bench into the stage for a groundbreaking confrontation that leaves everyone questioning the system. This is more than just an encounter. It's a movement, a call for accountability that you can't ignore. Witness how one act of defiance can ignite a global conversation about power, respect, and equality. You won't believe what happens next. Are you ready to see the truth unfold? Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet, now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible news stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. The afternoon had settled over the park, the air filled with the rustling of leaves and the soft hum of distant traffic. A man sat on an old, worn bench by the fountain, his hood pulled low over his face. His coat, faded and frayed at the edges, had clearly seen better days, while the brown paper bag beside him was crumpled, stained by time. His mismatched sneakers peeked out from under the hem of his jeans, worn from countless miles walked. The man seemed oblivious to his surroundings, his posture still and unbothered. A police cruiser rolled into the parking lot, its tires crunching over the gravel. Two officers stepped out, boots clicking sharply against the ground. The younger officer, with his fresh buzz cut and a shiny badge catching the afternoon sun, adjusted his belt as he surveyed the park. His partner, a stocky man in his 40s with a weary look and a coffee-stained uniform, followed suit. The younger officer gave a short nod toward the man on the bench. "Another vagrant," he muttered, casting a disdainful glance. The older officer sighed, his voice tinged with resignation. "Let's see what he's about first. Maybe he's harmless." They approached the bench, their footsteps slow and deliberate, the sound of their boots on gravel loud in the quiet park. The man didn't move, his gaze fixed on the ground as if he hadn't noticed their approach. The younger officer, impatience evident in his voice, spoke first. "You can't just sit here all day," he said, his tone sharp and commanding. "This is a public park, not your living room." The man looked up, his eyes half hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. He didn't speak, his face unreadable, but he reached slowly into the brown paper bag at his side. The younger officer tensed, his hand instinctively hovering over his baton. "Easy," the older officer murmured, his tone less certain. "Let's not escalate things." The man pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and began unwrapping it, his movements deliberate but calm. He took a bite, chewing quietly, as if the officers were invisible. "Did you hear me?" the younger officer snapped, his patience wearing thin. He took a step closer, towering over the seated man. "I said you can't just sit here all day. You got somewhere to go." The man swallowed his bite and glanced up briefly, meeting the officer's gaze for a fraction of a second before returning his attention to the sandwich. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said, his voice steady. "Just eating my lunch." The younger officer's frustration deepened. "That's not the point," he retorted, his voice rising slightly. "People like you make the place look bad. You scare off families and tourists." The older officer crossed his arms, watching the exchange with a mixture of weariness and growing concern. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone rough but less aggressive than his partner's. The man hesitated for a moment, fingers tightening around the sandwich in his hand. "Nick," he said after a pause. "Nick Carter." The younger officer snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Nick Carter? What? You a Backstreet Boy in your spare time?" he mocked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Nick didn't respond, his expression remaining impassive as he took another bite of his sandwich, letting the silence stretch out between them. The younger officer's irritation grew. "Let me see some ID," he demanded, stepping closer to the man. Nick set his sandwich down carefully, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a worn leather wallet. He handed it over to the officer, who flipped it open with practiced precision. The ID inside appeared legitimate, though it seemed at odds with the man's current disheveled appearance. The officer frowned, scrutinizing the ID for a moment before handing it back. "What are you doing here, Carter?" the officer asked, a note of suspicion creeping into his voice. "Why aren't you at a shelter or something?" "I like the fresh air," Nick replied simply, slipping the wallet back into his pocket. "Is that a crime?" The older officer shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. "He's not doing anything illegal," he muttered, his voice quieter now. "We can't just kick him out." "Maybe not," the younger officer grumbled, narrowing his eyes. "But we can make him uncomfortable." Nick's jaw tightened slightly, though he said nothing. Instead, he picked up his sandwich again and took another slow, deliberate bite. The tension between him and the officers hung in the air, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who slowed their pace. Curiosity piqued. A woman walking her dog approached, her voice hesitant but firm. "He's not hurting anyone," she called out, her gaze fixed on the officers. "Why are you bothering him?" The younger officer turned to her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern," he snapped. "It's a public park." The woman stood her ground. "He has just as much right to be here as anyone else," she shot back. The older officer stepped forward, raising a hand to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job," he said calmly. "Please move along." The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on the dog's leash. She glanced between the man on the bench and the officers before shaking her head. "Fine," she muttered, continuing on her way, though she cast one last look of defiance over her shoulder. Nick watched her go, a flicker of amusement or perhaps annoyance crossing his face. He set the sandwich down, brushing crumbs from his lap. "Am I free to go?" he asked, his voice calm but with a subtle edge of challenge. "You're not under arrest," the older officer said, though he shot a warning glance at his partner. "But you might want to find somewhere else to sit." Nick nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the younger officer just a moment longer than necessary. Then, with a quiet sigh, he stood, picking up the paper bag and tucking it under his arm. As he adjusted the hood of his coat, a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead. "Have a nice day," he said, his voice low but pointed, before turning away and walking off, his pace unhurried but purposeful. The younger officer watched him leave, his expression darkening with growing frustration. "You see the way he looked at me," he muttered, glaring after the retreating figure. "Guy thinks he's better than us." "Let it go," the older officer replied wearily. "He's not worth the paperwork." As Nick's figure disappeared down the path, the tension in the park began to ease, but an unspoken challenge lingered in the air, an undercurrent of something unresolved. The younger officer continued to stare after him, his jaw clenched. "I don't trust him," he said quietly, his words more to himself than to his partner. "There's something off about him." "You don't have to trust him," the older officer replied, his voice resigned. "You just have to leave him alone." But the younger officer wasn't ready to drop it. His mind raced, trying to piece together the small details that didn't quite add up. The way Nick had spoken, so calm and calculated, as if he wasn't afraid of them. The way he had sized them up with a single glance. The way he walked away, tall and deliberate, like someone used to being in control. "He's hiding something," the younger officer muttered under his breath as he climbed into the cruiser. The older officer sighed, knowing better than to engage. "Let it go," he said again, though his words lacked conviction. "He's gone. No harm done." The man sat once again on the park bench, beneath a thick canopy of ancient oak trees that offered a comforting shade. The paper bag rested by his side, still unopened. He leaned back, his posture unhurried and relaxed, as his eyes fluttered closed. His face remained impassive, though there was a subtle aura of purpose that surrounded him, an unmistakable feeling that he was waiting for something. Perhaps for someone, the serenity of the moment felt deliberate, as though he was tethered to the spot by forces unknown. It didn't take long before his solitude was interrupted. A pair of joggers approached, the rhythm of their sneakers crunching loudly on the gravel path beneath their feet. As they neared the bench, their conversation trailed off, their attention pulled by the figure seated there. One of the joggers, a middle-aged man sporting a sleek fitness tracker and an expression tinged with mild disdain, nudged his companion. He murmured something under his breath that barely reached the ears of the man on the bench. The woman beside him glanced at the man seated on the bench, her expression shifting into one of subtle discomfort. "Should we call someone?" she whispered, her voice tinged with concern. The man beside her, his voice low but clear, responded. He looked sketchy. His words hung in the air, a soft accusation that stirred the stillness around them. The man on the bench opened his eyes, his gaze flicking to the joggers for a brief moment before returning to the sky above. He said nothing, his face betraying no emotion, but the atmosphere around them seemed to thicken. The joggers exchanged a glance, their unease palpable. After a moment of hesitation, they picked up their pace, their footsteps hurried and distant as they left the bench behind. The quiet of the park returned, but only for a short time. Soon, the sound of laughter filled the air. A group of teenagers on bikes came into view, their voices loud and carefree as they weaved between the trees. One of them spotted the man sitting on the bench, and with a mischievous grin, he slowed down, gesturing for his friends to follow. "Check this out," he said, pointing at the man. "Yo, you homeless or something?" he called out, the words sharp and cutting, yet full of amusement. The man didn't respond. His expression remained calm, his eyes locked onto the boy with a detached curiosity. Emboldened by the lack of reaction, the teenager leaned in closer, his grin widening. "You lose your house playing Fortnite or what?" he mocked, his words dripping with ridicule. His friends laughed, the sound a cacophony of jeers and taunts. One of them pulled out a phone, holding it up like a weapon, ready to record the encounter. "Say something for the camera, man," he sneered. "Tell us your life story." The man, his gaze unwavering, finally spoke. His voice was low and measured, carrying an air of quiet authority. "You should get going," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "This isn't a place for games." The teenagers faltered, their laughter slowing as they exchanged uncertain glances. There was something in his voice, something calm yet commanding, that made them reconsider their decision to stick around. Before they could decide whether to leave or escalate the situation, the distant sound of a police cruiser pulling up nearby caught their attention. The group of teens scattered, their bikes kicking up dust as they sped away. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, his sharp gaze immediately locking onto the teenagers, who had already disappeared into the park's winding paths. "What's going on here?" the younger officer called out, his voice carrying authority. The teens were long gone, but his eyes were still focused on the man on the bench. "You again," he said, striding toward him. "Couldn't find another park to loiter in." The man didn't move. His posture remained relaxed, almost passive, as he met the officer's gaze with calm eyes. "Is sitting on a bench against the law now?" he asked, his voice steady. The officer's jaw tightened, a mixture of frustration and suspicion simmering just beneath the surface. "You've got a smart mouth," the officer muttered, stopping a few feet away from the man. "I don't like smart mouths." The man, unfazed, replied evenly, "Good thing I'm not here to make friends." The older officer, joining his younger partner, gave a frustrated look between the two of them. "What's going on here?" he asked, clearly irritated. "Why are we back?" "I don't trust him," the younger officer replied, his gaze never leaving the man on the bench. "He's up to something. He's sitting on a bench," the older officer retorted, exasperated. "Let it go." But the younger officer was not ready to back down. He took a step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his hip, his suspicion palpable. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. The man's gaze remained steady as he tilted his head slightly, studying the officer with quiet intensity. Lunch, he replied simply. Prove it, the officer pressed. Without hesitation, the man reached down and picked up the paper bag, holding it out for the officer to see. Inside, there was nothing but an apple, a sandwich, and a bottle of water. The younger officer frowned, his suspicion deepening. You got something else on you? He asked. Something you don't want us to find? The man set the bag back down, his movements slow and deliberate. I've got nothing to hide, he said, his voice calm. But if you're looking for trouble, I'm not the one you'll find it with. The older officer sighed, shaking his head. Let's go, he said, his tone dismissive. We've got better things to do. But the younger officer hesitated, his instincts telling him there was more to this man than met the eye. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hidden beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite place. His jaw tightened as he stared at the man on the bench, unable to let go of the suspicion that gnawed at him. His partner had already turned toward the cruiser, but the younger officer wasn't ready to walk away. Something about this man, his calm demeanor, his unshakable composure, set his teeth on edge. It was as if the man was playing a game, and the officer hated the feeling that he might be losing. You're awfully calm for someone getting this much attention, the younger officer said, his voice low and sharp. Most people in your situation would be a little more nervous. The man didn't flinch. Most people aren't breaking any laws, he replied simply. Are you saying I should be nervous? The officer asked, stepping closer, his hand still resting on his baton. I'm saying you're acting like you've got nothing to lose, the man said evenly. And that makes me wonder what you're hiding. I've got nothing to hide, the man repeated, his gaze unflinching. You've searched me. You've searched my bag. If you're still looking for something, that's on you. The older officer, standing a few feet away with one hand on the cruiser door, sighed heavily. Come on, he called to his partner, his tone final. He's not doing anything. Let's move on. But the younger officer ignored him, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man in the hooded coat. You've got an answer for everything, don't you? He asked, his voice laced with irritation. You think you're smarter than me? The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and unwavering. I'm not trying to prove anything, he said, his voice calm but with an edge. I'm just sitting on a bench. The officer took another step closer, his body language tense, the silence between them thickening. You think you're clever? He muttered. You think you can just sit here and make me look like an idiot? I think you're making yourself look that way, the man said softly, his voice cutting through the tension with an unsettling calm. The older officer stiffened, stepping between his partner and the man. Enough, he said firmly. We're done here. But the younger officer wasn't ready to back down. No, we're not, he snapped, his frustration bubbling over. This guy's playing us. I can feel it. Feel it all you want, the older officer replied sharply, his patience wearing thin. You don't have anything on him. Leave it alone. For a moment, it seemed like the younger officer might argue. His face was flushed with anger and humiliation. But then, reluctantly, he stepped back. His hand dropped from his baton, his body language tense as he muttered, Fine. We go. The man on the bench said nothing, his eyes following the officers as they turned and walked back toward their cruiser. But as the younger officer reached the car, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His eyes met the man's for a brief moment. And in that instant, an unspoken challenge passed between them. In the cruiser, the older officer shook his head, starting the engine. You've got to let this stuff go, he said, his tone tired. It's not worth the trouble. It's not about trouble, the younger officer muttered, staring out the window. It's about respect. That guy thinks he's untouchable. He's not, the older officer sighed, pulling the cruiser onto the park's main road. Just let it go, he repeated. We've got better things to do. But the younger officer couldn't shake it. His mind raced with possibilities, each more frustrating than the last. Who was this guy? Why did he act like he had nothing to fear? Why did it feel like he was hiding something? even though there was no evidence to prove it. Back on the bench, the man watched the cruiser disappear around the corner. His expression remained unreadable. He reached into the paper bag beside him and pulled out the sandwich he had started earlier, unwrapping it slowly. His gaze flicked briefly to the cluster of trees nearby, where a man in a gray hoodie stood, watching him. The man in the hoodie stepped forward, his movements cautious but deliberate. He stopped a few feet from the bench, glancing around to make sure they weren't being watched. The man on the bench continued to sit in complete stillness, his calm demeanor almost unnerving. His hands remained folded in his lap, as if he had all the time in the world. Even as the tension between him and the officers mounted, the younger officer's frustration was palpable. Each word he spoke laced with growing annoyance. "What are you hiding?" he asked, his voice tight with impatience. The older officer, on the other hand, seemed tired. His shoulders sagged and the lines on his face deepened with each passing moment. "We've been through this," he said, his tone weary. "This isn't worth the hassle. Let's just move on." But the younger officer wasn't listening. His suspicion had become an obsession. "You're not just some random guy," he muttered to himself, more to convince himself than anyone else. "No one acts like this unless they have something to hide." The man on the bench finally spoke, his voice calm and unhurried. "Maybe I just enjoy the view," he said, his words dripping with quiet authority. "But if you want to keep playing this game, I'm happy to oblige." His gaze met the younger officer's with an unreadable intensity, as if daring him to make the next move. A pause hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. The older officer, clearly at the end of his rope, stepped forward. "Let it go," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're wasting our time." The younger officer's jaw clenched as he turned his focus back to the man. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snapped. "You think you can just sit here and we won't notice?" The man raised an eyebrow, his calm expression unwavering. "I'm not trying to be clever," he replied evenly. "I'm just sitting here." The younger officer's hand twitched toward his baton, but he didn't make any sudden movements. "You know," he said, his voice tight, "people don't just sit in parks all day for no reason. You've got a reason, and I'm going to find out what it is." The older officer stepped in again, his patience finally wearing thin. "Enough," he said sharply, pushing his partner back. "We're done here." But the younger officer wasn't done. His frustration, his suspicion, only grew with every second. "You're not fooling me," he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he watched the man. "Something's off. I can feel it." The older officer shook his head, turning back to the cruiser. "Let's go," he said. "This is just a waste of time." But even as they turned to leave, the younger officer couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. Something about the man on the bench didn't add up. Why was he so calm? Why didn't he show any sign of fear, of nervousness? And why, when they had checked his ID, did it come back with no records? Something was off, and the officer wasn't about to let it slide. In the cruiser, the younger officer seethed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I know something's wrong with that guy," he muttered, his eyes scanning the park paths, still searching for any sign of the man. "No record? No one just disappears like that." The older officer exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. "It's not like that," he said. "Not everyone's hiding something. Maybe the database is outdated. Maybe he's just a guy who wants to sit on a bench." The younger officer shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. "No, he's playing us. I don't care what you think, but I'm not going to let it go." The cruiser circled back toward the park. Sure enough, the man was still there, seated on the same bench. His posture hadn't changed. The paper bag beside him was folded neatly, as if he had already finished eating, and yet his demeanor was still unwavering. The younger officer stepped out of the car first, his eyes fixed on the man, as though he expected some kind of reaction. The man on the bench looked up slowly, his gaze meeting the officer's. "Miss me already?" he asked, his voice calm but with a hint of amusement. "We're not done with you yet," the younger officer snapped, stepping closer. "The ID you gave us? It doesn't exist. Care to explain?" The man raised an eyebrow. "Maybe your system's broken," he replied evenly. "Or maybe you're just looking for something that's not there." The older officer interjected, his voice measured, though it carried an edge of finality. "We're giving you one last chance," he said. "If you've got something to say, now's the time." The man leaned back, his posture relaxed, but his eyes locked onto the officer's with a quiet intensity. "What exactly do you think I'm hiding?" he asked, his tone curious, even playful. "A secret identity? A criminal record? Or maybe I'm plotting a sinister overthrow of the local park bench economy." The older officer pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly done with the whole encounter. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered. The younger officer wasn't ready to let it go, though. He reached for his radio again, his fingers trembling slightly with impatience. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, he said, his voice tight. "I need a record check on an individual named Nick Carter. ID provided earlier." The radio crackled to life. "Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by." The younger officer's frustration flared. "What do you mean no records?" he demanded. "There's no way this guy doesn't have a record." The dispatcher's voice came through again. "No matches found for Nick Carter under the provided ID. Either the ID is fake, or there's an error in the system." The younger officer's grip on his radio tightened, his gaze fixed on the man in disbelief. "He's lying," he said, his voice thick with accusation. The man on the bench didn't flinch. "If that's true," he replied coolly, "why didn't you spot it earlier?" The younger officer's frustration reached its boiling point. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" he growled, stepping closer. But before the confrontation could escalate any further, the older officer intervened once again. "We're done here," he said firmly, grabbing his partner by the arm and steering him back toward the cruiser. "Let's go." The younger officer's eyes remained fixed on the man as they walked away. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with lingering suspicion. Back on the bench, the man watched the cruiser pull away, his expression unreadable once again. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small device. As he turned it over in his hand, a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. The game was unfolding exactly as he'd expected. "Just tell us why you're here," the younger officer demanded, his voice tight with impatience. "Otherwise, my partner won't let this go. We both know that." The man sitting on the bench looked at him, a flicker of recognition passing over his face. "You've already made up your mind about me, haven't you?" he replied coolly. "Nothing I say will change that." The younger officer stepped closer, his fingers brushing the baton at his side. "You think you're clever?" he sneered. "Think you can just sit there, acting like you're better than us?" "I don't think I'm better than anyone," the man answered evenly, his gaze steady. "But I do think you've got something to prove." The words hit hard, and the younger officer's face flushed with anger. Before his partner could intervene, he moved even closer, looming over the man. "You think this is a game?" he growled. "You think you can just sit here and make me look like a fool?" The man met his gaze unbothered. "I think you're doing a fine job of that on your own," he said calmly. The older officer grabbed his partner's arm, pulling him back with firm restraint. "Enough," he said, his tone sharp. "We're not doing this." But the younger officer wasn't ready to back down. "He's hiding something," he said, frustration thick in his voice. "I know it. He's too calm, too confident. Nobody acts like that unless they're hiding something." The older officer sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Even if he is, it's not our job to harass him until we find something. We don't have probable cause." "Drop it." "Probable cause?" the younger officer repeated, his voice rising. "How about a fake ID? How about refusing to leave when we told him to? It's a public park." The older officer's voice was sharp now, matching the tension. "He doesn't have to leave unless he's breaking the law, and so far he hasn't. The man on the bench watched the exchange quietly, his expression neutral but keenly observant. He seemed to be mentally cataloging every word, every movement. It was as if he was taking notes for a much larger plan. "You're going to regret this," the younger officer muttered, pointing a finger at him. "Whatever you're up to, I'll figure it out." The man tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I'm sure you will," he said. "Good luck with that." The words hung in the air, thick with defiance, only escalating the younger officer's frustration. He stormed off to the cruiser, his partner trailing behind reluctantly. As they drove away, the younger officer's mind raced. "He's playing us," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "I know it," the older officer, weary, replied. "Or maybe you're just reading too much into this." But the younger officer wasn't listening. He was already forming a plan, determined to uncover the truth about the man on the bench, no matter what it took. Back at the park, the man watched the cruiser disappear, his calm demeanor unaffected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small device again. He turned it over in his hands, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The game wasn't over. He was ready for whatever came next. The younger officer, now alone, approached the bench again with renewed determination. His partner had finally stepped back, unwilling to partake in what he considered an unnecessary vendetta. But for the younger officer, this was about control, about getting to the bottom of whatever the man was hiding. His hand rested on his baton as he mentally rehearsed his next move. The man was still there, calm as ever. His hood had been pushed back fully, revealing more of his face. He looked relaxed, but there was an intensity in his eyes that unnerved the officer. "You've got some nerve," the officer said, stopping a few feet away, his voice low and tense. "Sitting here, acting like you own the place." The man looked up, unfazed. "It's a public park," he replied. "Nobody owns it." "You've been playing games with me all day," the officer spat, his anger bubbling over. "I'm done. Tell me who you really are, or I'll make sure you regret it." The man tilted his head slightly, a smile barely visible. "You really want to know who I am?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge. "Enough with the smart remarks," the officer growled, his patience finally snapping. "Let's see some real ID. No tricks, no fake names. Just the truth." The man's movements were slow, deliberate as he reached into his coat pocket. The officer tensed, his grip tightening on his baton, prepared for any threat. But the man didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he produced a sleek black smartphone, the polished surface gleaming in the light. "Here's the thing," the man said, his tone carrying weight. "I don't need to prove anything to you. But since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll give it to you." The officer leaned in, brow furrowed, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The screen showed footage of the officer himself earlier that day, standing over the man with aggression in his tone, demanding answers. Every word, every inflection was crystal clear, as if the whole interaction had been captured on film. "What is this?" the officer demanded, his voice rising in confusion. "This," the man said calmly, "is a live stream. It's been running all day. Every interaction we've had, every word you've said, has been broadcast to millions of people." The officer's face drained of color. His grip on the baton faltered. What are you talking about?" The man stood up, his full height imposing as he faced the officer. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm not Nick Carter," he said, his voice slicing through the tension. "I'm Elon Musk." The officer blinked, his mind struggling to process the words. "Elon Musk," he stammered. "You're kidding?" "I don't kid about things like this," Elon replied, his tone even but carrying quiet authority. "I've been conducting an experiment, testing how people like you treat those you perceive as less fortunate." The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His mind raced as the realization dawned. The calm demeanor, the confidence, the way the man had handled every interaction. It all made sense now. "You set me up," the officer finally whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and panic. "I didn't set you up," Elon replied. "I gave you a choice. Every action you took, every word you said, was your own. All I did was observe." The officer's face turned bright red, his frustration boiling over as the weight of his own actions crushed him. "You had no right," the younger officer spat. His voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You had no right to do this." "I had every right," Elon replied calmly. "You're a public servant sworn to protect and serve. But instead of doing your job, you chose to harass someone you thought was beneath you." The officer stepped back, his mind racing, struggling to find a way out. "You can't use this," he said. "This is entrapment. It's illegal." "It's not entrapment," Elon countered, his tone even. "I didn't force you to do anything. As for legality, my lawyers would be happy to explain why you don't have a case." The officer's panic deepened as the full scope of the situation began to settle in. The live stream, the growing audience, the undeniable evidence. It was too much. He had thought he was in control, but it was now clear that Elon had been several steps ahead the entire time. Outside the park, a crowd had begun to gather. News crews arrived, cameras trained on the scene, their reporters whispering into microphones. The younger officer's face contorted with humiliation as he realized they were here for him. His voice shook as he pointed at Elon. "This isn't over. You won't get away with this." Elon's expression remained unchanged. "It's already over," he said. "The world's watching now." The officer's face turned pale, his confidence evaporating as the weight of the situation took hold. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat, his voice rising in desperation. "Dressing up and playing games. You're nothing but a fraud." Elon didn't flinch. His calm demeanor remained unshaken as the officer's frustration escalated. "This isn't about me," Elon said, his voice measured yet firm. "It's about accountability, about how people in positions of power treat those they think are powerless." The officer's anger flared. "Powerless?" he barked. "You're Elon Musk, for God's sake. You're a billionaire. Don't act like you're some saint coming down from the heavens." Elon raised an eyebrow. His expression was unmoved. "Exactly," he said. "And yet you treated me like dirt the moment you assumed I was homeless. Imagine how you treat people who don't have the resources to fight back." By now, the officer's partner had arrived, his face pale as he took in the chaos. He grabbed the younger officer by the arm, pulling him back. "Stop talking," he whispered urgently. "You're making it worse. I'm not going to let him get away with this." The younger officer shot back, his voice trembling with anger, but his partner's grip tightened, the warning in his eyes finally sinking in. "You already did," the older officer said quietly. "Just stop before you dig the hole any deeper." The crowd murmured, their voices a mix of disbelief and indignation. Words like abuse of power and disgrace rippled through the gathering, and the news crews were fully set up. Cameras zoomed in on the confrontation. Reporters spoke animatedly into their microphones, their words broadcast live to millions. Elon turned his attention to the crowd, his calm authority filling the space. "This isn't about one bad officer," he said. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about holding people accountable, not just for their actions, but for their attitudes." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound reverberating through the park. The younger officer's face flushed red, his humiliation complete. His eyes darted to the cameras, and the realization began to dawn that his every move was being broadcast to the world. "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the noise. "I was just doing my job." "Your job is to serve and protect," Elon said, his gaze sharp. "Not to profile, harass, or abuse your authority. And if you can't handle that responsibility, then maybe you shouldn't wear the badge." The officer's partner stepped in again, his tone now pleading. "Let's go," he said. "We need to leave." But before they could retreat, Another voice cut through the chaos. "Officers, stand down." Everyone turned to see a woman in a crisp suit approaching. She exuded authority, her presence commanding the attention of the crowd. The badge clipped to her belt identified her as a high-ranking member of the Internal Affairs Division. The younger officer's eyes widened as she approached, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "You've made quite a mess," she said coldly. "I hope you're prepared to deal with the consequences." "Ma'am, the officer began, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Save it," she said. "I've already seen the footage, and I think the public's made their opinion pretty clear." She gestured to the crowd, which was now openly booing the younger officer. The Internal Affairs officer turned to Elon. "Mr. Musk," she said, her demeanor softening slightly. "On behalf of the department, I'd like to apologize for what you've been through today. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be dealt with." Elon nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The woman nodded and turned back to the younger officer. "Hand over your badge and weapon," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "What?" The officer stammered, his face pale. "You can't be serious." "Do it," she snapped. "You're on administrative leave, pending an investigation, and trust me, this investigation will be thorough." The officer's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge and weapon, handing them over with a look of utter defeat. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a mixture of triumph and relief as justice began to take shape. As the officer was led away, shoulders slumped, Elon turned to the cameras one last time. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. If we want to create real change, we need to hold people accountable. Not just when they're caught, but every single day." The crowd roared their approval, applause echoing through the park as the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. The younger officer, now stripped of his authority, was escorted away, his humiliation complete. The news crews lingered, some still capturing shots of the park bench where the day's events had unfolded. Elon remained standing near the fountain, hands casually tucked into his coat pockets as though this were just another ordinary day. The Internal Affairs officer returned to him, her expression still one of professional seriousness. "Mr. Musk," she began, "I want to personally assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. The department doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior." Elon nodded but didn't smile. "I hope so," he replied, "because it's not about one officer. It's about the culture that allows these things to happen." She hesitated, clearly unsettled by the weight of his words. "I understand," she said finally, "and I'll make sure your concerns are heard." As she walked away, Elon turned back to the bench. A faint trace of a smile played on his lips as he sat down again, pulling out his phone and scrolling through the live stream comments. They were pouring in by the thousands, expressions of outrage, support, and shock at what had unfolded. "This is exactly why we need accountability," one comment read. "Elon Musk just exposed a huge problem," another said. "This isn't just about one cop. It's about the whole system." Elon's smile widened slightly as he typed a response. "Change starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going." Nearby, Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman who had been watching everything from the sidelines, approached him cautiously. "I had no idea who you were," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But what you did is brave. You didn't have to do that." Elon looked up, his expression softening. "Sometimes the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand," he said. "And sometimes the only way to fix it is to shine a light on it." She nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Well, thank you," she said, "for standing up for all the people who can't." He nodded back, watching as she walked away. Nearby, the officers who remained on scene were speaking with their superiors, their postures tense as they awaited instructions. The younger officer, now stripped of his badge and weapon, sat in the back of another cruiser, head in his hands. His career, if not his entire life, was in ruins. The weight of his actions hung heavily over him. The internal affairs officer had already begun reviewing the live stream footage with a team of investigators, their expressions grim as they pieced together the chain of events. For Elon, this was just the beginning of a larger effort to address systemic issues. He had no intention of backing down. The story you've shared paints a vivid picture of Elon Musk using a tense confrontation to highlight issues of systemic power abuse, with a particular focus on law enforcement and societal biases. The sequence is compelling, with the younger officer's downfall serving as a pivotal moment, as Elon challenges the prevailing systems and attitudes toward power dynamics. The conclusion, with the note left behind on the bench, is symbolic, a call for others to share their stories and not allow their voices to be silenced. The ending reinforces the broader theme of accountability, framing Elon's actions as part of a larger movement for change. This part resonates deeply, suggesting that the fight for justice and respect is not just one individual's battle, but a collective, ongoing effort. The note under the bench adds an emotional touch, showing how a simple act of kindness can spark a larger conversation. The impact of this event, amplified by the viral sensation, marks a significant cultural moment where people from different walks of life can reflect on their own behaviors and biases. Elon's message about holding ourselves and others accountable is powerful, especially in the context of a system that often overlooks its flaws. The fallout for the younger officer highlights the reality that consequences are inevitable when actions are exposed to the public. It's clear that this moment serves as a learning opportunity for all involved. The story is a strong narrative about the transformative potential of accountability, change, and the power of public awareness. If you'd like, I can help further refine or expand specific elements of the story. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful moments and important conversations. Together, we can continue pushing for change and holding ourselves accountable. Let's keep the conversation going. Your story matters.